What can you tell us about the events that took place last night and this international reaction to it since? Some of your thoughts.
So far, it appears to have been a targeted and sort of, I would say, narrow but deep international engagement led by the U.S. in reaction to Iran and Israel's tensions, and the world has thus reacted. And I think what happens next is probably as or more important than what's already taken place. And I think there are fears, both internationally and here at home, that this is maybe the beginning of a longer engagement. And I think that has people nervous. Obviously, it has the attention of the world, but for those of us who've been paying attention to politics and international relations from the United States in the last 30 or 40 years, it's not uncommon for us to begin what seems as a sort of exciting and targeted and successful engagement that then lasts 5, 10, 15, 20 years from there. And I think that's what has people a little concerned here at home.
Yeah, and I think the biggest hope is that a mission like that was successfully carried out as far as being able to destroy the capabilities. So, assuming that there are a number of capabilities that are destroyed, it seems like the big question now are what are Iran's current capabilities as far as attacking Americans abroad. We've heard from their state television that that seems to be a goal of theirs going forward. But what's the realistic possibility that that happens? And what type of attack would that look like?
I tend to believe that many of these countries, like Iran, I think North Korea comes to mind as well, their ability to actually reach us, the United States, the complexity and the sophistication of their weapon systems seems very, very unlikely. I'm sure there's someone that could come on and tell you that there's a certain type of missile that can reach us, but I just tend to not worry about that as much. That being said, I do think when we come to the aid of our allies, whether it's Israel, or I think we've seen this to a great extent from a resource standpoint in Ukraine with Russia, we draw red lines, right? So if we reacted to Iran's involvement in Israel to the threshold that allowed us to attack them in the way that we did in the last, 48 hours, what if they attempted again? Do we then respond in kind? Do we respond with a greater force? That's what gives me pause. I think that's what gives me concern is that at this point, I don't know what the golden road is for Iran other than fear of being attacked again. And I don't really know what this looks like because it kind of reminds me of every time I've ever looked at the that particular region in our world that there's constant tension, constant strife. I just don't know what the path forward looks like, and I think that's what can make someone very uneasy, and I think that's what could make voters uneasy if this continues to drag out in a way with the U.S. involved in a heavy way.
Yeah, it seemed like there's the concern. It's such a recent parallel, but the worry that this incident for Republicans and for the president would turn into what Afghanistan was for President Biden. And what's the likelihood of that? I know it's a lot different in the sense that we actually don't have, or to our knowledge, do not have American troops on the ground in Iran versus what, of course, was a long-standing policy to have American troops on the ground in Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, in an attempt to lighten this up a little bit, I know our friends in Las Vegas are familiar with betting markets, certainly as it relates to sports. Polymarket has the likelihood of an engagement on the part of the U.S. between now and next Sunday at 4%. So I do think there's a high likelihood that this was more like a sort of shock and awe, and that we achieved the mission and that we move forward. Now, even 4% is very scary. And again, if the past is any indication, the U.S. isn't great at sort of making a splash and then moving on. We seem to find our ways back into wars pretty routinely. So I hope that's not the case. I hope that Iran recognizes that the path forward is sort of treacherous if they continue to engage with Israel, an American ally, as they have. And I hope that and this is, bordering on Pollyanna-ish. I hope this brings folks to the table. The president has indicated an interest, and I think a history of being a deal maker. This is going to be a tough deal to strike, but my hope is that we can bring people in that region together and have, hopefully less bombs, less folks dying, less engagement from a military standing going forward than we've had in the past.
Yeah, it seems like the big question now going forward is, and likely to what you had just said, was this sort of the shock and awe, and then for this front of it, but then also perhaps laying the groundwork for Israel to then move in with different types of attacks as well. Of course, they've been launching missiles for some time, and that's what it seems like one of the big questions is going forward. Is that the strategy? And then I think a part two to that is you have a growing American a group of people that are still just upset with the handling of Israel's war in Gaza. What's the difference between the Gaza Strip and Iran? Of course, I think perhaps the largest one perhaps seems to be the size of the two countries, because of course the concerns are the civilian death toll that we've seen over in Gaza.
Yeah, I think I mean, watching this sort of from a distance for quite a while, I do believe that Israel wants to exist. And that to me seems like a very reasonable threshold, right? They want to be able to have their country. Now, they happen to be surrounded by a lot of other countries that don't want them around. They're not sort of welcome there. The means by which Israel was created is a point of disagreement for many people in that region. Now, going forward, that either needs to be an accommodation on the part of the folks that are in that region and outside of Israel, or Israel needs to leave. And there are folks in some of the countries and some of the communities around Israel that would love to see them pushed right off into the ocean. The U.S. has thus far said that's not going to be the case. Again, I don't know what that looks like going forward, because I think that's a fairly accurate description of the way it stood for the last 40 or 50 years. So I don't know what changes. One thing that could be helpful is there's a tremendous amount of wealth in that region, especially as it relates to resources and gas and oil specifically, that many countries, including the United States, at least are impacted by, if not rely on. So again, I think there are more folks, including President Trump, that are incentivized to bring folks together and have less bombing and less death going forward than more. But again, if I'm a betting man, do I expect in a year or 10 years or 20 years that we're still talking about tension between a number of countries in the Middle East and Israel? That's probably a pretty safe bet, unfortunately.
And then just the last few questions for you. What does this look like for President Trump's coalition? It seems like it was very fascinating because we're so used to instant reactions online and on the web. And we knew how a number of the folks in the MAG coalition were thinking about this. It was maybe different from how he, of course, went on to pursue this action. What do we see today that was maybe different than last night? Or what are we going to see, in, I should say, too, and predict in the coming days that maybe align for a particular policy or particular line of thought moving forward, and of course into those 2020 into 2026 and those very important midterms?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Number one, it's always a little difficult to talk about domestic politics when there are literally people that are having bombs dropped on their country, right? So my thoughts go out to whether it's the folks in Israel that wake up, I think, every day with concern about being attacked, or it's folks in Iran that woke up in the last couple of days with, I assume, a lot of fear around the future of their company as it related to the United States involvement from a military standpoint. Um, as far as the sort of politics of MAGA world, there were a lot of people, I would kind of broadly cast them as sort of Joe Rogan voters, that voted for President Trump because of his willingness to shake things up really on three fronts. One is immigration. I think that's been a success. Two was government spending, kind of remains to be seen. There was Doge sort of work done, but unclear where that's going to land. And the third was our forever wars and engagement overseas. That has now been called into question. So two of those three sort of points that drew a lot of new voters to the Trump coalition, I think are in question at this moment: government spending and foreign engagement. The last thing I'll say about this, there were a lot of folks, especially from the progressive left, that fell all over themselves for us to engage in Ukraine to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. Most Americans to this day couldn't find Ukraine on a map if you paid them $1,000 to do it successfully. We didn't really hear a peep from really any party as it related to engagement in that war. However, when we took part in what appears so far to be a targeted attack in Iran, and it was done by the Trump administration, there are a bunch of Democrats that are all of a sudden falling over themselves about the role of the United States in other countries. So I think it's dishonest. I think anytime you have a party out of power, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, it's getting increasingly hard for them to find anything they can remotely support the other party on, or the president in office, whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And that should be very concerning and disappointing for American voters, because in the past, when we've gone overseas, there was this tendency to support our country regardless. I think that's been called into question by the whatever half of the people that aren't in power in a majority at that particular moment, and that's really disappointing. So my hope is that people can get together, cooler heads prevailed. Congress should get engaged as it relates to what the United States does, especially if it's going to become a war in a traditional sense. And I hope that they do in a thoughtful way, whether it's in Ukraine or in more recently, if it's going to be in Iran.
And there's last couple questions for you. You preempted my Democrat question. We saw Dina Titus, representative in Southern Nevada, sign on with Thomas Massey's recent piece of legislation just about notifying Congress before military action has taken place. What kind of organizing are you going to expect here from Democrats the next days? How do they get their message in line? We're still waiting to hear it back, by the way, from some other Democratic lawmakers from the state of Nevada as well. In addition to a number of them across the country are just kind of waiting to see, okay, this is the type of argument that we need to have and we need to move with going forward.
Yeah, I think Congress' role in declaring war is pretty clear, although for a number of decades now, the president's role in engaging from a military standpoint in foreign countries has really come at the cost of Congress's role. So just as a watcher of politics and as a voter, I do hope that our legislative branch continues to engage and has more of a seat at the table on these sort of decisions, because they are closer to voters. So they're more accountable. They are elected more frequently. They represent smaller communities. I would hope that Congress plays an important role, whether it's in Ukraine or Iran or the next country that most of us have never heard of that we find ourselves almost at war with. As it relates to the Democrats specifically, I just hope that they maintain the same level of interest and involvement in this thing as they would have done whatever thing that President Biden was doing just 5 or 6 months ago. And that remains to be seen. I think if they're just sort of casting stones from the sideline, it's not going to be well received by voters. And again, like, there is a debate to have about Congress's role in what countries we engage with militarily. And it should probably be more than it has been for the last, again, 30 or 40 years. But that's a debate that they need to bring before the American people. And ultimately, the American people will reward whichever party, if they're looking for more accountability, or maybe they want to further empower our executive branch to engage militarily because they can be more nimble and move quickly. That may ultimately get litigated and make its way to the Supreme Court as it relates to the role of the executive branch versus the legislative branch. We'll see. But again, I hope that Democrats and Republicans continue to keep this president or the next accountable as it relates to our engagements overseas.
And then last question for you. I know folks in Nevada, as well as other places along the West Coast, they have concerns about World War III and what that may involve. It's perhaps unlikely that a country like China would find themselves involved in this type of conflict. Maybe North Korea is a little bit different. As far as weaponry, we don't see any evidence that Iran would have that type of capability to reach someplace like here on the West Coast. That said, how prepared should folks be here for any sort of more of a world involvement with issues that could be seen overseas? Obviously, we know about Russia, Ukraine. There's perhaps that third front when everyone talks about, which is Taiwan and China. So I guess the likelihood of Las Vegas or these other large metropolitan cities being tied into this particular war front, and also just noting as well, with Las Vegas also hosting Nellis Air Force Base, it's a notable place where a lot of planes fly out of.
Yeah, it's a good question to ask. It's obviously heavy, right? I don't know how much preparation you can have for, fear of being bombed or attacked. I really believe that going forward, we'll see less of what we've seen in the last 48 hours and more of the sort of cybersecurity and economic warfare. So I do think that the movement to sort of throttle throttle oil and gas as it relates to other countries and then would therefore impact the American market. So we could see our gas prices go up as a result of greater tension in the Middle East. I also think that we could see additional attacks on our technology sector, right? We could see people going after our ability to rely on our cell phones. I mean, if they attacked other telecom assets, imagine if the internet went down in a chunk of the country for even a period of time, the lost productivity. You're talking, billions of dollars in matters of minutes if the right systems go down. There's been discussion around our water infrastructure, our energy infrastructure, and targeted attacks on things like that. So I really I don't foresee a Iranian boat, making its way up to Long Beach. That's not something I can wrap my mind around. Do I, expect to wake up here in the next couple of weeks and find that China's done something that's taken down some banking system that means I can't get on my online banking or I can't conduct business for the day, and that's all that lost productivity? That seems realistic. The drones, the number of drones that are being produced, just the sheer volume, I think that's frightening. I mean, we've seen some sort of bizarre things. I know in New Jersey earlier this year with unidentified drones. So I think warfare is going to look very different. I don't lose much sleep over kind of a traditional war or a kind of war games attack on our biggest cities. I just can't wrap my mind around that. It'll probably be economic and technology based, and that should be nearly as worrisome as other sort of traditional attacks that can take place.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, the situation where Americans are trying to get out of the hole of inflation and to see the potential of gas prices go right back up is not something that many people would want to see, and that's as a type of economic warfare. So, Tal Eslick, thank you so much for joining me today.